Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. The title of our presentation is Special Economic Zones and Transnational Zones as Tools for Southern Africa's Growth, Lessons from International Best Practices. The authors are Weliswa Matekenya, Siden Mishi, Leward Jeke, Ronin Wadi, and myself, Roslyn Karambakua. We are all from the Department of Economics. This study has been prepared under the Southern Africa Towards Inclusive Economic Development SATIED program. I'll start by introducing Special Economic Zones SEZs. These are geographically delineated areas with separate administrative, regulatory, and fiscal regimes. They are a creation by the government to provide unique and suitable infrastructure, support services, and essential support systems. A specific tax and other related incentives to attract local and foreign investments into the zones is used, for example, duty-free exports. Fewer regulations are also there, improved infrastructure, free repatriation of profits, and advantageous geographical location. There is also increased prospects for economic growth emanating from the zones, achieving increased trade balance, increased investment, job creation, and effective administration. In terms of background to our study, globally there are approximately 5,400 special economic zones, but Africa is only 4.4% of this, which is 237. The special economic zones are a spatial industry strategy used by more than 140 economies worldwide. And 3/4 of these are found in Asia, mostly in China, the Philippines, and India. The special economic zones encompass transnational zones, industrial development zones, export processing zones, and raw economic development, amongst others. Transnational zones or border development zones interlink countries and reduce the problem of cumbersome border controls such as tariffs that hinder trade. The objectives of our study are threefold: to assess the role of special economic zones in harnessing economic growth prospects in Southern Africa through the development of SEZ's best practice typology, evaluating international experience to see what lessons can be learned for Southern African special economic zones, and evaluating special economic zones best practices. The methodology that we used is a comparative analysis of case study globally that have successfully implemented the SEZs. A focus on setup and governance of SEZs, analysis of overall performance on exports, growth, and employment generation, case study analysis of SEZs in Southern Africa to find out what can be learned and how the SEZs can be improved. Proposed best practices typology is then developed from these case studies using the successful case studies. Risks associated with adoption of best practices policies are also discussed. The key design indicators for comparative analysis are as follows: legal and institutional background, fiscal incentives such as tax exemptions and fiscal subsidies, on-site amenities including customs office and procedures, and also one-stop shop. Country context including regional characteristics, access to markets and transportation centers, and the length of experience with SEZ type programs. The key outcome indicators that are used for comparative analysis are as follows: job creation, direct or indirect, export performance, investment attraction, and spillover industry diversification. So the special economic zones in South Africa are as follows. South Africa is the largest economy in Africa and it is home to 10 special economic zones. Industrial development zones began in 2000 and were later transitioned to special economic zones in 2007. There are 4 categories of special economic zones that have been established, that is industrial development zones, free port, free trade zones, sector development zones. In terms of the success of the IDZs, there were over 5,000 direct jobs that were created and 43,000 construction jobs were also created. However, there were challenges that have been faced with South Africa's IDZs and also SEZs. Between 2002 and 2010, only 40 investors had set up in 3 operational IDZs, that is Kruger, East London and Richards Bay. Total investment was valued at 11.8 billion, whilst government had invested 5.5 billion rands, which is almost half of that. By 2010, Kruger received 3 billion rands government investment in infrastructure, while only 21 investors and 2,800 jobs were created. The IDZs have not contributed significantly to economic growth according to literature. The requirement that South African zones be linked to a seaport or international airport excludes areas with potential for growth, proximity to inputs, for example. South Africa's IDZ programs design was like that of Malaysia and Indonesia, but these 2 countries have successfully established their special economic zones, meaning that the problem with South Africa's IDZs is not design. Moving on to Southern African region special economic zones. Historically, these zones were developed and operated by governments, and they generally lack a strong business case. The goal of these zones is to grow manufacturing sector and exports and also to diversify the economy. But they have generally not been very successful as there has been sluggish growth. They are falling behind their peers in other continents on investment, exports and employment creation. There is high cost of doing business. We are looking at customs clearance, etc. Low levels of intra-regional trade hindering overall development, no diversification, technological innovation and structural transformation. Hence, there is need for review of regulatory and legal framework that is challenging the special economic zones in Southern Africa. So we looked at various aspects pertaining these zones. Ownership, like I have explained, is mostly government ownership. In terms of transitioning from one form to another, in Zimbabwe, export processing zones have transitioned to special economic zones, whilst in South Africa, industrial development zones have transitioned to special economic zones. Then in terms of delineation of geographic location, in Malawi, there is no specific dedicated zone. Thus, companies can set up where it is convenient. In other countries, the special economic zones are either separate geographical areas or single factory units, and they must produce at least 85% of their products for export. In terms of infrastructure and amenities, the special economic zones have inadequate infrastructure and lack amenities such as gas, roads, etc. On legislation and governance, there is weak SEZ governance, inefficient bureaucracies, and poorly designed legal frameworks, and also slow institutionalization of fiscal incentives. The government is both the regulator and developer of these zones, crippling private sector zone development. On specific goal, there has been slow or limited institutionalization of fiscal incentives, and African SEZs enhance manufacturing and exports on low-skill, labor-intensive industries, unlike their counterparts in other regions. Few countries target diverse sectors and higher value addition, and these are, for example, Morocco and Rwanda. So now moving on to case studies of successful special economic zones. We are looking at Southeast Asia, where they've had successful special economic zones, which began first as labor-intensive zones, and then they moved to become more innovation-driven with science parks. So they became successful initially due to competent workforce, good infrastructure, and effective management. And the boom that China experienced has been attributed to the special economic zones and also major infrastructural development. There were also business value chains, social networks in China, and also continuous technology, learning and upgrading. For countries such as Philippines, there's been transformation to multi-activity zones, then to special economic zones, and currently manufacturing zones. Also in Philippines, the government embarked on building infrastructure to ensure growth of the zones. The SEZs have been performing well due to amenities for countries like Bangladesh, India, Sri Lanka, and also land in Bangladesh is very cheap for the firms. In Sri Lanka, there's been duty exemption for importation of equipment, construction material, production inputs. Then in Asian countries, they also have tourism zones, natural resource processing zones. Then there's also favorable fiscal infrastructure and regulatory policies which attracted substantial investments into the zones. The zones in Asia are located nearer to airports and seaports. And in India, more than 60% of the special economic zones specialize in ICT-related manufacturing and services. Also in India, innovation, protection of intellectual property, and best-in-class manufacturing infrastructure is experienced in the zones. And for Latin America and Caribbean countries, there are natural resources, infrastructure, and consumer goods which continue to attract the foreign investors into the zones. We can look at countries such as Paraguay, whereby they've got a port authority which manages free trade ports and warehouses for neighboring countries' seaports. And this is an opportunity for Southern African countries that have got access to the sea. They can actually provide such a service for landlocked countries. Mexico also has successful special economic zones along its border with the USA. We also have other countries such as Cambodia, whereby they've got special economic zones developed near border corridors to promote cross-border trade and investment, and also economic links between urban and rural areas. Then there is an interesting case of Shannon in Ireland, whereby special economic zones have been successful without fiscal incentives. So Shannon in Ireland was established in 1959 and it used special tax incentives, but these incentives were then later ceased. After that, the zone continued to improve and it is now a leading international business park. So what happened there? There was the concentration on physical and concept growth. For example, an industrial estate was set next to the special economic zone, benefiting local businesses whilst also helping in expanding the zone. So this Shannon case can be used to bring solutions to the problem of burdensome special economic zone fiscal incentives. However, in South Africa, there are 3 industrial parks that were shut down when incentives were ceased in the early 1990s. Hence, lessons from the Shannon case can actually be used to avoid such shutdowns when incentives are ceased. So this is just an example of some of the goals that are set and how they were achieved. For example, in Kenya, about 60,000 jobs were created in the zones. In the US, 68 million jobs were created. In Philippines, employment increased by 10% from 2001 to 2010. And in China, 30 million jobs were created. Then, still on achieving goals, we are now looking at exports. For Southern African countries, there's been little growth in exports, not more than 25% on average. But for countries such as Russia, Honduras, Dominican Republic, there's been growth in exports above 60%, even up to 82% for Russia. Also in China, growth in exports and other Asian countries. So globally, the lowest contributors are South Africa and Kazakhstan with 2.1 and 7% share of exports. And for South Africa, it is strategic to consider interlinkages with regional infrastructure, which is in other countries, and use its size and international exposure to be Southern African gateway to investment. In terms of achievement of investment goals, SEZ investment in Africa grew by 11%, in developed countries by 27%. We can see that China's share of SEZ in FDI has been growing dramatically, reaching 82%. And a regional SEZ for Southern Africa may actually help to motivate foreign investors as they realize that there is minimized risk in a regional special economic zone compared to individual country zones. Having discussed the various case studies, I now present the strategies that we came up with to spur growth and employment in Southern Africa. So there's need for improvement of infrastructure, interlinkages of infrastructure within the countries and also across the borders of the region. There's also need for reskilling and upskilling of management of zones. There's need for agglomeration, considering also growth of transnational zones. Also necessary is knowledge-intensive clusters to start off with regional vision for shared costs and also ability to draw on rightly skilled labor. We came up with an IRIA Pentagon, which is a best practices Pentagon, which outlines 5 critical components to ensure successful and impactful special economic zones in any country. Southern African countries need to apply the developed IRIA framework first to evaluate the current special economic zones and in planning for any new special economic zones. So this is the framework that we developed. It's called a Pentagon, IRIA Pentagon, because it has got 5 sides. So I stands for institutional framework. This relates to the conceptualization and establishment of a special economic zones, which are the building blocks in institutionalizing the concept. So we are looking at type of the zone, development and ownership, focus, location, and so on, infrastructure, amenities. Then R stands for running or operation framework, relating to how the zone establishment is managed on a day-to-day basis, role of government versus private sector, public-private partnerships, and so on. E stands for expansion, relating to the growth that is expected beyond the initial establishment. We are looking at innovation, science parks, multi-activity versus speciality, transnational zones, etc. Then moving on to A, which is achievement, attaining, relating to meeting the targets, realizing the set goals. We are looking at targets such as jobs, investment, export promotion, industry diversification. R, reflection. This relates to reviewing the performance against set targets or peers, generating feedback. So that is monitoring and evaluation, assessment of the zone's performance against targets, and also looking at what other peers are achieving. So it's all about being forward looking. So this is the illustration that we came up with based on this definition of a special economic zones and also the best practice case studies. We realized that the special economic zones in Southern Africa generally fail to meet the IRIA best practice identified in this Pentagon. One important aspect that we also found out as we were carrying out our study is that the issue of promoting private sector SEZ development is critical. Southern Africa is generally not promoted private sector participation in SEZ development, except for a few cases such as the multi-facility economic zones in Zambia, which is developed by the Chinese developers. Private sector special economic zones can continue to grow in the absence of fiscal incentives if private developers are promoted. So the private sector can cover financing and knowledge gaps, develop selected industries, including public service. Globally, countries are moving towards successfully promoting the private sector investment through capital injection in high economic and social impact projects and using public-private partnerships. This enables governments to reduce the burdensome and unsustainable fiscal incentives. However, having looked at all the successful case studies in the IREA framework, Southern African countries need to be wary of some risks faced in adopting all these strategies. Firstly, there are different economic and geographical structures between these countries and the countries where these SEZs were successful. Also, there is an undeveloped regulatory environment and framework in Southern Africa, low political commitment, that's risk of poor governance and poor coordination, high risk of failure due to public good component of SEZs, and the SEZ's return on investment is low because of the use of government public funds with no profit motives. The public-private partnerships may actually help to reduce the risk of special economic zones failure. The successful special economic zones offer investor incentives, and this is a risk in government total revenues. Thus, fiscal incentives must be supported by other sources of raising funds and should be used only to attract first movers. There is also a high risk of losing more foreign investors due to high taxes outside the special economic zones. The one-stop shop might actually also risk conflicting ideas with other governmental departments. Further, a big chunk of the budget is allocated to special economic zones, leading to neglect of other regions of development, and there is a risk of government failure in provision of goods and services. The low labor costs are effective for special economic zones to garner more profits and succeed. However, if Southern African special economic zones reduce their wages, it will lead to loss of skilled labor and also labor force strikes, which is not good for economic growth. Africa is a labor-intensive continent, and low wages will mean low income and poor growth. Countries have other regulations also which risk failure to attract good investors. In terms of conclusions and recommendations, the study set out to investigate how special economic zones can be used to unlock growth and employment in Southern African countries. And a case study approach was utilized, getting lessons from the rest of the world to inform special economic zone establishment, operation and support systems in Southern Africa. The study proposes a best practices typology in the form of a Pentagon IREA framework. Even though established by government, special economic zones need to be established with a strategic view of self-sustenance and clear-cut governance systems with commercial focus. Performance is not easy to measure. However, indicators used are job creation, export contribution, investment attracted, and Southern Africa is lagging on these indicators. Transnational zones can be a stepping stone towards regional integration. With this, I come to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.